Welcome to this afternoon's event. I'm glad that you are here and that could join us. My name is John West. I am a senior fellow with Discovery Institute. Discovery, for those of you who do not know, is a think tank, and it was started in 1990 by Bruce Chapman and George Gilder. We have programs in a variety of areas. And really, most of them look in some way at the intersection between science, technology, and culture. And that ranges from our technology and democracy program that looks at what it takes to have an entrepreneurial culture where you have economic freedom and economic progress, to even our Cascadia program that deals a lot in our region, especially with the needs for mass transportation and really the interface between technology in the area of mass transit and things that help tie us together as a region. It certainly also is the basis for the work that we do in our bioethics program with Wesley J. Smith and the impact of science and technology on bioethics, and also in the work we do at the Center for Science and Culture, which deals with the evidence that we find in nature of purpose and of design. We also have a small program that actually predates many of the programs I just mentioned here on religion and civic life. And so we have also been interested in the interface between faith and public life, not just in the areas of faith and public life and technology, but just faith and public life in general. And that is the subject of this afternoon's event. Faith and public life, separation of church and state, they're perennial issues in the American public square. In the past few days, we've seen them rise again in the national news media coverage of the social studies standards adopted in the state of Texas. The proper relationship between church and state has been an issue really since the early years of the Republic and raises some foundational issues about what it means to be a citizen, about how we relate to our fellow citizens, citizens of different religious beliefs and no religious beliefs in the public square. We are very pleased, and I am personally very pleased, to have with us today one of the nation's really foremost, rising, thoughtful, reflective young scholars on the nature of religious liberty and the relationship between religion and politics. Dr. Philip Munoz is author of this recent book by Cambridge University Press, God and the Founders, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson. I'd encourage you to get it if you don't have it. Unfortunately, I don't think we have copies here. I think Dr. Munoz was going to bring some, but they didn't quite arrive, so you'll have to go to Amazon or some other place to get them. But it's a terrific book and hope that you get it. I've had the privilege of knowing Dr. Munoz since 1994 and have seen him grow from a gifted young student to a gifted and still young but mature scholar who has much to teach us about the relationship between faith and politics. Dr. Munoz is the Tocqueville Associate Professor of Religion and Public Life at the University of Notre Dame. He is a past professor at Tufts University and a past visiting fellow at Princeton. He earned his PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate School in California. He's written for First Things, the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, and the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. He has testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, their subcommittee on the Constitution, civil rights, and property rights. And he has appeared on Fox News, the Voice of America, C-SPAN, National Public Radio, and even Turkish radio and TV. And I don't know the story of that, hasn't shared that with me, but that's quite an accomplishment. In the public square, Dr. Munoz was a notable contributor to debates over the constitutionality of the Pledge of Allegiance, and even debated atheist Michael Newdow at the University of Maryland on the topic, "May our children say under God in our public schools?" So, with that, I'd again encourage you to get this book, God and the Founders, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson. It's a great book. And I will bring up Dr. Munoz to give a talk. He'll talk for around 30, 40 minutes, and then followed by Q&A. So, Dr. Munoz?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay in the back? It's a real treat for me to be here with you today. I was born here in Seattle, so this is something of a homecoming for me. Lots of friends in the audience. Thank you all for coming. My research on the Founding Fathers and Church and State actually started here in Seattle. In 1994, I attended a seminar that taught by Dr. West, and that seminar had a great influence on my life and impacted my interests, certainly. And really, I can say that that seminar led to where I am today. So thank you, John, and thank you to Bruce Chapman at Discovery for inviting me back to address you this afternoon. Our subject today is our Founding Fathers and the separation of church and state. For over 60 years, lawyers, judges, scholars have debated how the founders meant to separate church and state and protect religious freedom. From time to time, usually when a federal court makes a controversial decision, the debate moves from academia, where I am, to the airwaves. In 2002, for example, when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals found under God in public school recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance unconstitutional, conservatives decried liberal judicial activism and how it was betraying our nation's founding principles. Well, the Founding Fathers usually do work for Fox News. In church-state law, liberals, too, employ the founders. When a narrow court majority upheld a Ten Commandments monument on the grounds of the Texas State Capitol in 2005, it was the liberal dissenters that claimed the court's conservatives were abandoning the founders' secular republic and trying to impose their version of state-sponsored Christianity on the nation. Considering that the modern court first cited Jefferson and Madison to guide Establishment Clause jurisprudence in 1947, one might have thought by now we would have come to some agreement about how the founders intended to separate church and state. But 3 generations of scholarship, 3 generations of court decisions, and confusing judgments have left us more divided now than ever before about our founding history. What I want to try to do this afternoon is explain why this historical debate persists, why we haven't come to any resolution about the Founding Fathers and separation of church and state. I also want to try to explain who gets what right, at least from my point of view. So to do this, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to start with the liberal and conservative stories about the founders on church and state. I'll then explain what the founders actually thought, at least from my perspective. And I'll do this by focusing on 3 founders, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington. And then I'll conclude with a few thoughts about how we might more thoughtfully and I think more accurately approach the founders' competing wisdoms. So let me begin with the liberal story of church and state. An oversimplified version of the liberal story goes something like this. In the beginning, there was persecution, and it was bad. Wars of religion devastated Europe. Catholics persecuted Protestants, Protestants persecuted Catholics, Protestants persecuted other Protestants, and everybody persecuted the Jews. Settlers came to America to escape religious persecution, but before long, religious dissenters were oppressed here too. The nasty habits of the old world infected the new because religion was intimately connected to politics. And religion by its nature breeds unreasonable and hence unresolvable conflict. The cycle of theological disputes leading to political oppression persisted, again, this is the liberal story, until the founders built the first secular republic in the modern world. The founders separated religion and politics, which secured freedom by preventing sectarian disagreements or religious or theological disagreements from contaminating political life. The key to the founders' solution in the liberal story is the privatization of religion and the elimination of religion from the public square. This privatization was furthered by the Supreme Court in the 20th century. Prayer and Bible reading were eliminated from the public schools. Parochial schools, mainly Catholic schools, were prohibited from receiving most public funds, and many religious symbols were removed from the public square. According to the liberal story, all of this was done in the spirit of the founders and the founding. To the extent that religion hasn't been completely privatized, for example, by the court's decision in 2001 to allow publicly funded vouchers in private schools, religious schools, liberals understand this to be a deviation from the course of history our founders intended to place us on. The judicial authors of this story are Justice Hugo Black. Black, it's come out recently, he was a member of the KKK before he was on the court. Justices Brennan and Marshall, 2 liberal icons of last century. And more recently, Justices Souter, Stevens, and to some extent, Justice O'Connor. Okay, so that's the liberal story about church and state. The conservative story goes something like this. The conservative story it has really been written in response to the liberal story. For the most part, conservatives agree that the founders meant to separate church and state, but conservatives deny that this means religion must be separated from politics. The separation of church and state for conservatives means that no one particular religion ought to be favored by the state. Conservatives tend to believe that the state can favor religion generally as long as the state does not single out one church or one religion for special privileges. Conservatives, at least academic conservatives, tend to be somewhat suspicious of the founders' political theory. Maybe that's because some conservatives think the liberals might actually be right. But conservatives admire the founders' practices. Conservatives relish documenting the many and various ways the founders supported religion. The Declaration of Independence, of course, has 4 references to God. The first Congress enacted legislation appointing publicly funded legislative chaplains, and it did so the same week that it passed the First Amendment. 3 of the first 4 presidents issued official days of prayer and thanksgiving, and the Supreme Court, under John Marshall, our first Chief Justice, started the tradition of starting its sessions with prayer. Actions, conservatives say, speak louder than words, and the founders' actions reveal a long history of non-sectarian, general governmental support of religion. The authors of the conservative story include Chief Justice Rehnquist, Justice Scalia and Thomas, and former federal judge and legal scholar Michael McConnell. Okay, so who's right? We have this conservative story and this liberal story. Or to be more subtle, which story is most accurate or more accurate? I'll be candid. When I started the research for my book, I fully expected that history would vindicate the conservative story. But it turns out the historical record is a bit more complicated and certainly more interesting than either the liberal or conservative story would have us believe. It turns out, at least from my point of view, that the leading founders disagreed about the proper separation of church and state. As I'll try to show over the next half hour or so, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington offered different approaches to the proper relationship between religion and politics. Both the liberal and conservative stories contain some truth, but both stories miss as much as they get right, and both stories offer an incomplete and therefore a misleading understanding of God and the founders. Now, in my elaboration of the founders' political philosophies, I'm going to assert some points without adequately documenting them. I say this in part to invite you to ask questions when time allows at the end of my talk. I encourage you to press me on any points that you think I leave underdeveloped. Okay, let me start with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson's the most interesting and the most difficult founder to understand, and he's interesting and difficult for the exact same reason. Jefferson did not practice what he preached. Jefferson said one thing about religious freedom, but he often did something else. When reflecting on our third president, one always has to ask, is this Jefferson the rhetorician or Jefferson the hard-headed, anti-clerical political actor? What Jefferson publicly declared is encapsulated in his famous statute for religious freedom. This is a Virginia bill passed in 1786, authored by Jefferson. In it, Jefferson recognizes, in the Virginia statute, Jefferson recognizes 5 overlapping rights, and these are summaries from the bill. He calls these natural rights. The problem is that Jefferson did not follow these natural rights principles in his own political practice. In my book, I try to document all the various ways Jefferson acted in contradictory ways, or what seemed to me to be contradictory ways. But here, let me talk about the contradictions I find most revealing. Although Jefferson declared that no individual civil capacity should be affected by religion, that's point 5 here, Jefferson repeatedly sought to impose special civil disabilities on members of the clergy. In 1783, he drafted a proposed constitution for the state of Virginia. In it, he excluded ministers of the gospel from eligibility for election to the General Assembly. When asked why he did this, why exclude ministers, Jefferson responded in a surprisingly candid manner. Now, I remind you, though, this letter was private at the time. He said, "The clergy are excluded because if admitted to the legislature at all, the probability is that they would form its majority. Clergy had to be excluded from the ballot because if they weren't, they'd probably win. And clergy couldn't be allowed to hold political office because clerical power, Jefferson said, has filled the history of 10 or 12 centuries with too many atrocities not to merit a proscription for meddling with government. Jefferson failed to get his exclusion into the Virginia state constitution, but his efforts to restrict clergymen's civil rights and reduce their societal influence would resurface time and time again. In an 1817 bill establishing elementary education in the state, Jefferson was a founder of public education in America. Jefferson sought a legal prohibition against clergymen serving on the Board of Visitors, something like basically the local school board. Jefferson did not want clergy directing or influencing Virginia's public schools. The legal exclusion of clergymen was just one aspect of Jefferson's larger church-state reformation project. Jefferson sought the transformation of America's religious opinions through public education. He insisted that young school children not read the Bible in Virginia's public schools. Young minds, he said, and I'm quoting, are not sufficiently mature for religious inquiries. Jefferson recommended instead that children be taught morality with, again quoting, the most useful facts from Grecian, Roman, European, and American history. Jefferson wanted scripture banned from the curriculum so children's minds and imaginations would be kept free from miraculous truths and revealed dogmas. Superstitions, he believed, would inhibit the critical analysis he wanted more advanced students to undertake. Of course, you know the story of Jefferson's Bible. This is when Jefferson was president. I'm not sure when he did this, but maybe on the weekends. He took a copy of the New Testament and he literally cut and pasted the Gospels. And he cut out what he thought couldn't be true and pasted what he could be true and made his own Bible. And what he cut out was all the miracles and any references to Jesus' divinity. Okay. When he planned his beloved University of Virginia, Jefferson designed the curriculum to minimize clerical influence. Instead of a professor of divinity, which was standard at the time, Jefferson proposed a professor of ethics. This, he thought, would allow the university to teach morality without sectarianism, and most importantly, without hiring a member of the clergy. When Jefferson made his first round of faculty appointments, he caused a public stir by selecting a number of professors known for their heterodox religious opinions. Evangelical Christians at the time were so distrustful of the university that they almost killed funding in the legislature. It was only because Jefferson was Jefferson that he was able to get his university funded. So why did Jefferson want to keep Bibles away from school children and clergymen away from college students? And why was he willing to suspend the civil rights of clergymen, even in contradiction to his own stated principles of religious freedom? I believe what explains Jefferson's actions is that he held a progressive or a developmental view of religious freedom. He did not believe that we could ascertain fundamental rights or natural rights and then straightforwardly apply them directly into political life. Jefferson thought religious freedom had to be established, and that required taking into account the social context, or what we might call the distribution of power in society at the time. And Jefferson thought clergymen were too powerful. He was particularly keen to subjugate clerical influence in education because he thought that that is, clerical power, stood as a barrier to progress in human thinking. Jefferson embraced the basic Enlightenment critique of religion and religious authority. Church authorities, he thought, invented theological doctrines to disarm human reason, and then they used those dogmas and the power of the state to suppress the ideas and individuals that might threaten clerical power and influence. But if men were freed from the artificial constraints that clergy had imposed, Jefferson believed that they would be guided by science and reason alone. He was a true progressive insofar as he believed that to secure progress, one only had to remove what he referred to as monkish ignorance. The opinions and institutions that Jefferson thought most responsible for monkish ignorance were those advanced by ecclesiastical religion and their clergy. To establish religious freedom, then, required the subjugation of their influence in American society. The one sentence that encapsulates Jefferson's approach to church and state is not his famous wall of separation metaphor found in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, but this candid statement, which he wrote in 1813. Jefferson said, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government." Although Jefferson articulated natural rights principles in his famous Virginia Statute, his approach to religious liberty is more accurately characterized as a politics that sought to aid the march of progress by transforming and overcoming traditional religion, thereby emancipating individuals to develop their minds and spirits according to the dictates of reason alone. For Jefferson, religious freedom meant primarily freedom from the dogmas, influence, and priests of Orthodox Christianity. So it's no coincidence that the modern liberal story of religious freedom holds Jefferson as its hero. When the Supreme Court removed prayer and Bible reading from the public schools, when it eliminated religious symbols from the public square, and when it prohibited religious organizations from receiving public funds, it resumed the liberal project that Jefferson himself began. Okay, I know that's not your parents, Thomas Jefferson. When I gave this talk at UVA, I was very nervous that I'd be struck down. Okay, let me now turn a little bit more quickly to James Madison. No founder has been misinterpreted and misused more than Madison, a fact that's particularly ironic given that Madison's church-state principle is relatively simple and straightforward. Madison is usually portrayed as the constitutional foreman who built Jefferson's strict wall of separation. This interpretation was initiated in 1947 by Justice Wiley Rutledge in Everson versus Board of Education, the famous and first Establishment Clause heard in the 20th century. More recently, this interpretation of Madison was adopted by Justice Souter, recently retired from the court. Both claim that Madison was unrelentingly absolute in opposing state support of religion. This view is not exactly wrong, but it's woefully incomplete. The scholars and judges who have appealed to Madison have not understood the social compact theory that informed his thought, and in doing so, they fail to understand Madison's principle of religious freedom. Madison's most authoritative statement of religious freedom is his memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments. It's a 1785 document that he circulated to support Jefferson's Virginia statute. Sorry, this is going to be a little bit much to read, but I want to try to explain Madison's argument to you. This is from Article 1 of the Memorial and Remonstrance. It's a document that contains 15 articles or 15 points. In Article 1, it's amazingly compact. It really reveals Madison's mind, maybe the most rigorous mind of all the founders. And he gives a philosophical argument defending man's natural right to religious liberty. So let me try to take you through that argument. It's complex, but I'll try to simplify it as best I can. Madison derives the right to religious freedom from the nature of religion itself. Religion, he says, involves opinions about God and our religious obligations. And our religious obligations can only be fulfilled according to conviction and conscience. To use modern terminology, Madison means that our religious practice must be sincere or authentic to be truly religious. This means we cannot give authority over religion to the state, because our opinions, including our religious opinions, follow evidence alone. Opinions, we believe what we believe because of the evidence we see, not because the law tells us to behave in a certain way. Opinions and religious opinions cannot be coerced, which means the force of law cannot lead men to saving belief. Moreover, Madison says it would never be in our interests to cede authority over our religion to the government, because religious practices, again, must be sincere to be salutary. So just as rational men would not sacrifice their eternal souls for the temporary goods of their bodies, reasonable men who have been created to worship God according to conscience should never make their religious duties a part of the social compact. So unlike Jefferson, who thought traditional religion was superstitious, Madison thought it was the nature of religious obligations, or our religious duties, which made religion into a natural right. Because we have duties to God, we have a right towards other men for religious freedom. And not only was religion a natural right, it was a particular kind of right. What Madison said was an unalienable right. And by that he means we never give our religious freedom over to the government to secure our religious obligations. We always retain our religious obligations and fulfill them on our own terms. This has a powerful implication. Madison says, We maintain, therefore, in matters of religion, no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. Because man's natural right to religious liberty is unalienable, religion is not part of the social compact or our system of government, and therefore the state may not legitimately take cognizance of religion. Now, what does the word cognizance mean? That's the most important part of the passage. And again, this is from Article 1 of the Memorial and Remonstrance. Cognizance means the action of taking judicial or authoritative notice of, or jurisdiction. More generally, it means knowledge or perception, or a state of being aware of. So a state that's non-cognizant of religion lacks jurisdiction over religion. I know that sounds complicated, but let me give you a different example. If I said a colorblind constitution, you would know what I meant, right? Madison said we must have a religion-blind constitution. In a religion-blind constitution, lawmakers would not take authoritative notice of, they would not perceive, they would not benefit or punish citizens on account of their religion. In a religion-blind constitution, the government would not make distinctions between religious and non-religious citizens. The law would not use religion as a ground of preference or a ground of penalty. Madison's teaching on the proper relationship between church and state is state non-cognizance of religion, or a religion-blind constitution. And with only a handful of exceptions, Madison followed this principle throughout his entire life. Okay, let me try to give you a few examples of what this meant in practice for Madison. Madison wrote the Memorial and Remonstrance, this document that I'm quoting from, in opposition to a property tax that was proposed by Patrick Henry. What Henry wanted to do was have a 5% property tax in Virginia to support the clergy. So you paid this tax in tobacco at the time. So everyone would pay the tax, or at least property owners would pay the tax in tobacco, and then you'd specify which minister you'd want your tax to go to. So you could support your own minister, or if you didn't have a minister, your property tax would go to a general fund to fund education. But the taxes only went, and education at the time, this is before Jefferson's public education at the time was primarily religious. So it was a tax for religious education. But in practice, that means it was a tax for religious ministers. Because who were the educators? The ministers themselves. And the ministers could spend the money however they wanted. So this was a way to impose a religious tax to fund clergymen. Madison said the tax was improper. It was wrong for the government to tax citizens for support of religion. Why? Because the government had to be blind to religion. Right? That was his rationale. And that's why he writes the Memorial and Remonstrance. Now, it's Madison's position on the religious tax that has led scholars and judges, and more than a few Supreme Court justices, to identify Madison as a strict separationist. But what the strict separationist interpretation leaves out, is Madison also opposed state policies that punished or penalized religion. Let me give you an example of that. Remember Jefferson's exclusion of ministers that he proposed? Well, when Madison heard about Jefferson's proposed exclusion of ministers, he wrote to his friend and said that, Tom, you're wrong, right? You can't exclude ministers from a generally available civil right. It's to discriminate against religion and therefore to violate a principle of religious freedom. So while it is true that Madison stood against state action that directly favored religion, he also stood against state action that excluded or discriminated against citizens on account of religion. Madison's approach to the First Amendment, accordingly, would not support the liberal jurisprudence that voted to prohibit private schools from receiving state-funded vouchers, or that attempts to exclude religious groups from using public school buildings for after-school programming. These dogmas of strict separationism, the separation of all religious groups from public facilities and public funds, would unfairly, from a Madison point of view, would unfairly discriminate against religion and thus violate the principle of religious freedom from a Madisonian or a non-cognizance point of view. Under a Madisonian approach, religious schools should be treated no better, but also no worse than public schools, and religious citizens should be treated no better, but also no worse than non-religious citizens. So on church-state issues, Madison corresponds neither to the liberal or conservative story about church and state. Okay, even more quickly now, let me turn to George Washington. When one reviews George Washington's politics, you can't help but note how different they are from, certainly from Thomas Jefferson's, but even from James Madison's. Washington consistently sought to use governmental authority to encourage religion and to foster the religious character of the American people. Washington was not originally opposed to the property tax, to Patrick Henry's property tax. His initial reaction was that it was a good idea. This is what Washington said about the property tax. Washington firmly endorsed military chaplains, a second example of how his politics were different from Madison. Madison said military chaplains violated this principle of non-cognizance. Washington said that chaplains helped improve discipline, raise morale, they checked vice, and they fortified the courage and bravery of his soldiers. He also found that they helped secure obedience to command. As president, Washington inaugurated the tradition of declaring official days of prayer and thanksgiving, another point of difference from Madison. Now, it's true that Madison actually authored 4 official days of Thanksgiving during the War of 1812. He did so when he was president, but he said he was forced to do so by Congress, and after he left the presidency, he wrote that he thought such actions were unconstitutional. Washington took no such view. Washington's 2 religious proclamations both began by affirming the duty of all nations and the American people to acknowledge Almighty God. So the use of taxes to support religion, military chaplains funded by the government, presidential religious days, religious proclamations exemplify the distance between Washington and Madison on the proper disposition of government towards religion. Washington did not think the state should be blind to religion. He agreed with Madison that religious worship was a natural right and that the purpose of government was to secure rights and therefore to secure religious freedom, but he did not translate those general principles into Madison's specific limitations on the legitimate powers of government. Quite the opposite, actually, and I apologize again but I wanted you to have the full quotation. Quite the opposite from Madison. Washington's most definitive statement on the subject on religious freedom, in fact, pertains to the propriety of government support of religion. Now, these quotations are taken from Washington's famous farewell address. Washington declared, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Religion is indispensable, Washington explains a few lines later, because it is substantially true that virtue and morality are necessary springs of popular government. Virtue and morality are needed for public happiness because they prompt citizens to act in decent, truthful, and law-abiding manners. Virtuous citizens govern themselves and they respect the rights of others, thereby reducing the need for security through the coercive force of law. Virtue and morality are indispensable, in short, because they make limited government possible. And religion, Washington says, is indispensable for the cultivation of virtue and morality. Let us, with caution, indulge the supposition, Washington warns, that morality can be maintained without religion. Washington, of course, concedes that a few may be good on account of their refined education, but he suggests that most men, most of the time, require religion to fortify their character. Washington therefore endorsed the use of religion to nurture patriotic and moral citizens, something that Madison thought was unnecessary and illegitimate. From a Washingtonian perspective, Madison's non-cognizance approach ignored the reality that Republican government needs religion. To separate religious morality from state support would imprudently destabilize the foundations of the moral character upon which Republican or Democratic government depends. Washington thought Madison was too principled and somewhat naive. When conservatives say that the founders endorsed religion in general and Christianity in particular, they have in mind founders like George Washington. Like Justice Rehnquist and Scalia and many cultural conservatives, Washington thought that the state could favor religion because religion helped cultivate citizens' virtues, and especially the virtues necessary for a liberal democracy. Okay, so my argument, as you can no doubt see by now, is that the leading founders disagreed about the proper separation of church and state. In today's terms, Jefferson is a progressive liberal who sought to use state power to suppress the influence of religious orthodoxy. We can call Washington a conservative who would allow the state to support religion for political purposes, to nurture character. Madison is somewhere in between, or maybe off to the side. Madison would be most likely a libertarian in today's terms, who would limit the reach of the state by not allowing the state to favor religion or disfavor religion as such. Okay, so the founders disagreed, just like we disagreed. Does this mean that the founders are irrelevant or that we shouldn't pay attention to them? I don't think so. Certainly that line is not good for book sales. So let me try to explain 3 lessons we might learn from the founders' disagreement. Okay. From the perspective of originalism and constitutional law, strictly speaking, it's the meaning of the Constitution's text that is binding. But because the meaning of the First Amendment religion clauses is difficult to understand from the text alone, judges and justices and scholars have often turned to individual founders as a substitute for the text. The thought is if we can know what Madison or Jefferson or maybe even Washington thought, we can use their thought to interpret the First Amendment. That the leading founders disagreed means that there's no single church-state position that can claim exclusive authority of America's founding history. So the first lesson we ought to draw is that no one founder's position should be assumed to reflect the original meaning of the First Amendment. This also means that we should view jurisprudential appeals to any one founder with a large dose of skepticism, especially if an appeal claims to represent the views of the founders. It's easy to pick and choose from the founders to support different church-state jurisprudential results. If you want to keep prayer out of public school, you can refer to Madison. If you need a quotation to support prayer in public school, you can turn to Washington. If you want to eliminate religious participation in a generally available program, you can cite Jefferson's wall of separation. Too often, and this is especially true in Supreme Court jurisprudence, too often a single quotation or a handful of examples from one founder are used to imply that the entire founding generation stood for a particular understanding of religious liberty. But because the leading founders disagreed, simply having a founder on one side is an inadequate legal argument. Some will interpret this to mean, and the founders' disagreement to mean, that the founders are no longer pertinent to our contemporary church-state concerns. I disagree with that, because how the founders disagreed makes them worthy of our consideration. It's because they disagreed that they advanced arguments to defend their competing positions. And they made those arguments using philosophical reasoning and prudential calculations that can be as applicable today as they were 200 years ago. So the second lesson I would have us learn, disregarding the founders because they wrote in a different age, unnecessarily overlooks the thoughtfulness of America's greatest political thinkers. So even if we cannot turn to the founders in a deferential manner, we still can learn from their ideas and their arguments. If we do decide to adopt a view from the founding, which founder offers the best approach? My primary objective this afternoon is to explain the founders, not to evaluate them. But I'm not a historian, and so I don't want to leave it just at history. If history is to be useful, evaluations must be made. And so how do I evaluate the founders? Well, let me try to explain very briefly what I think is the best position and why. Let me say that something can be said for all 3 positions. But I think Madison's approach offers the most promise, in part because it avoids the fundamental weaknesses of the Jeffersonian approach and the Washingtonian approach. So this is the third lesson I would have us draw. The most dramatic problem with the Jeffersonian position is that it counsels discrimination against certain types of religion. Jefferson did not aim to be neutral towards religion. He aimed to subjugate Orthodox Christianity and to subvert clerical influence in American society. So if one does not endorse Jefferson's project to transform America's religious opinions, and if one does not share his anti-clerical hostility towards religion, it's hard to favor Jefferson's approach to church and state. Many conservatives find Washington's approach to be much more attractive because it allows the state to endorse religion and to promote religion for civic purposes, such as the cultivation of character. Those who agree with Washington of the beneficial civic purposes of religion are likely to be Washingtonians. And there's much that can be said in favor of this, but let me suggest a few drawbacks. Washington's view necessarily views religion in a politically utilitarian manner. Let me take prayer in public school as an example. A Washingtonian approach might defend prayer in public school the same way that Washington defended military chaplains. Prayer might be said to improve discipline, to check misbehavior, to help secure respect for teachers. Yet understanding prayer in this way fundamentally misunderstands why we pray from a religious point of view. It reduces religious activity to a means by which to achieve political ends. At minimum, this should make religious citizens uncomfortable. Moreover, if communal prayers were to be said in the public schools, someone would have to compose them, and that someone would have to be public school officials. I certainly don't want to disparage those who run the public schools, but entrusting something as important as prayer to them seems to me to be problematic. More generally, the Washingtonian approach, in my view, gives too much authority to the state over religion. In those instances when the interests of the state are different from what is good or true about religion, that authority can be very harmful to religion. One should hesitate always to disagree publicly with George Washington, but I think his position today could actually do more harm to religion than good, even if it does have some benefits. Madison's approach, I believe, would avoid this problem because it denies the state authority over religion. By requiring the state to remain non-cognizant of religion, it also avoids the hostility towards religion that the Jeffersonian approach can impose. Another strength of the Madison approach is that it embraces the old-fashioned understanding of equality before the law. A religion-blind government could neither privilege religion nor penalize religion as such. Religious citizens would have to be treated the same, no better but no worse than other citizens, than non-religious citizens. This is what we used to mean by equality. A further strength of Madisonianism is its transparency and its workability. In most cases, a religion-blind constitution can be applied consistently, straightforwardly, and with a minimum amount of discretionary judgment. Judges would ask, does the state action at issue, whatever is the controversy, in that controversy, does the state take cognizance of religion? In many instances, the requirements of non-cognizance are sufficiently knowable that church-state issues could be resolved without recourse to litigation. Take participation by religious groups in state-funded programs. Non-cognizance, or the religion-blind constitution, would prevent the state from either including or excluding participation on the basis of religion. Religious groups could participate in government-funded programs as long as they qualified for doing so on the basis of some non-religious criteria. Any state-funded program that limited participation to religious groups or excluded groups on account of religious affiliation would be impermissible. It's a relatively clear line, could be easily drawn and easily applied, and therefore lots of litigation could be avoided. The simplicity of Madison's principle is one of its greatest assets. Okay, more could be said both for and against Madison's approach, but let me stop here. I've tried to explain the church-state thought of our leading founding fathers. I've suggested that the liberal and conservative schools of thought continue to appeal to the founders in part because both sides can find something to support their positions in our history. But I hope I've made clear by now that both sides embrace a partial and therefore misleading history. By clarifying how Jefferson, Madison, and Washington actually sought to separate church and state, I hope that we might be provoked to think more clearly and therefore more deeply and more thoughtfully about how we can best protect religious liberty today. For reasons I too briefly sketched, I believe Madison and Madison's approach offers the most promise. Okay, thanks so much for your attention. I'd love to take your questions.